Well, this is the time for it's Easter time, resurrection, surprising events. A Jesuit will speak in the backyard of Notre Dame, and the originally scheduled speaker, Mario Mauro, is attempting to put together a new government in Italy, or at least involved in those conversations. So that will be also a resurrection experience of a sort. And I also find it very hard to resist invitations to come to Chicago, which is pretty much my favorite American city. And also because, quite frankly, over the years I have come to admire quite considerably the work of the Lumen Christi Institute. I think that Tom, strongly backed by Cardinal George, has found a place for raising issues of great Catholic interest in a very distinguished university, and in effect sharing the wealth from two very important institutions, the Catholic Church and the Archdiocese here, and the University of Chicago. So it's an honor to be here. It's also an honor to be on this panel with Jean Bethke Elshtain, with whom I've discussed mostly issues of war and peace and foreign policy over the years. So when I saw the general heading of subsidiarity and sovereignty, I thought, well, that gives a lot of scope. And I decided that I would take the, shall we say, the less exciting topic, but one that's of considerable internal Catholic interest, subsidiarity. In effect, the beginning of the canonical history of this is found in the encyclical Quadragesimo Anno of Pius XI. This was issued in 1931 in the midst of a global and European economic crisis, so not so very different from quite recent developments. And this was the second of the celebrated social encyclicals. It was issued for the 40th anniversary of the issuing of the original social encyclical, Rerum Novarum, by Leo XIII in 1891. The crisis of European civilization was more widely and more acutely felt in 1931 than it was in 1891. More comprehensive challenges of the political, economic, and social order were being raised in the aftermath of the Great War and the not yet fully grasped waves of the Great Depression. Most European states were less powerful and less confident than they had been in the last phase of the long peace between Waterloo and Sarajevo. Revolutionary changes at the end of World War I had profoundly altered Central and Eastern Europe. A multitude of new states, most of them with significant minority populations, had emerged from the wreckage of the German, Austrian, and Russian empires, and had entered the arenas of European politics and international diplomacy. Two of the major powers, Fascist Italy and Soviet Russia, stood forth as advocates and embodiments of ideologies of comprehensive social, political, economic, legal, and cultural change. The issues about ownership of property and about terms of fair cooperation between capital and labor had not been brought to anything like an agreed-on resolution. The cultural and economic dimensions of the crisis were probably most fully felt in Germany, though the country which was actually closest to internal collapse and massive bloodshed was Spain. So it is not surprising that Pius XI, after reviewing the landscape since Leo XIII and affirming the authority of the Church to address economic and social issues, took up as a major theme reconstruction of the social order. It is under this very broad topic that Pius articulates and interprets the principle of subsidiarity, a principle which was to enjoy a long and vigorous career in later Catholic social teaching, even while the contexts for applying the principle were to change enormously. And here I will read to you the key paragraphs in Quadragesimo Anno, 79 and 80. 79. It is indeed true, as history clearly shows, that owing to the change in social conditions, much that was formerly done by small bodies can nowadays be accomplished only by large organizations. Nevertheless, it is a fundamental principle of social philosophy, fixed and unchangeable, that one should not withdraw from individuals and commit to the community what they can accomplish by their own enterprise and industry. So too, it is an injustice and at the same time a grave evil and a disturbance of right order to transfer to the larger and higher collectivity functions which can be performed and provided for by lesser and subordinate bodies. Inasmuch as every social activity should, by its very nature, prove a help to the members of the body social, it should never destroy or absorb them. Paragraph 80. The state authorities should leave to other bodies the care and expediting of business and activities of lesser moment, which otherwise become for it a source of great distraction. It will then perform with greater freedom, vigor, and effectiveness the tasks belonging properly to it, in which it alone can accomplish, directing, supervising, encouraging, restraining, as circumstances suggest or necessity demands. Let those in power, therefore, be convinced that the more faithfully this principle of subsidiarity is followed, and a hierarchical order prevails among the various organizations, the more excellent will be the authority and efficiency of society, and the happier and more prosperous the condition of the Commonwealth. The Pope's ability to coat a near universal crisis with optimistic rhetoric is indeed remarkable. He then goes on to affirm that it is, quote, a major and pressing duty of the state and of all good citizens to get rid of conflict between classes with divergent interests and to foster and promote harmony between the various ranks or groupings of society. He proceeds to argue for the incompatibility of Catholicism and socialism, even though he acknowledges that socialism is neither monolithic nor immutable. The continued affirmation of this incompatibility was the factor that shaped both Catholic teaching and political practice until the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s. Today, however, I don't have the time nor the available erudition to review the ways in which the principle of subsidiarity has been modified or reconceived in different contexts in the Catholic world. I do think it's worth pointing out that subsidiarity is in many ways a protean term because it's involved in different historical and social contexts. It's brought into discussions about how to shape the European community, how to manage federalist systems, whether in Europe or elsewhere, how to organize vast stretches of society like the educational system or the healthcare system. It's a cluster of ideas that can be applied in different ways in very different settings. I'm not going to try to give you an exegesis of the thought of Pius XI or the various subsequent popes. It's more what one might call a set of philosophical variations on subsidiarity as a theme. Subsidiarity is in fact one theme in the larger social and ecclesial work, which is Catholic social thought, and the still larger work, which is the formation of a just and tolerant commonwealth. Like Leo XIII, Pius XI took a dim view of class conflict, both as a factor in political and economic life, but also as an indicator of how to read or shape the movement of history. Subsidiarity, he observes, is to be employed as a working principle in a social context in which both justice and the common good are taken into account. Pius accepts the changed scale of modern society and of the state, which guides and controls it. But he is clearly concerned about tendencies to hand over larger and larger areas of activity to state initiative and state control. He wants there to be a common bond, uniting groups for social purposes. He wants society to be ordered, harmonious, and hierarchical. Quadragesimo Anno 84. He expects and encourages the organization of society according to diverse functions. He calls for liberty in the formation and structuring of groups to fill these diverse functions. How can we characterize the principle of subsidiarity in more concrete terms? First, the principle presupposes the existence of a complex society which has at least a rudimentary constitutional order. Thus, in attempting to apply it, we can make reasonable judgments that some institutions are public, some are private. Some institutions are local, but others are central or comprehensive. That institutions will have some legal mandate for the exercise of their powers. That there will be recognized procedures for establishing and dissolving the institutions. Second, within the constitutional order, there will be goals or values which are widely recognized and agreed upon. These goals will make it possible for us to make arguments and assessments about what institutions and what policies achieve or fail to achieve these goals and these objectives. In doing this, we will have ways to sort out what results are accomplished by the normal working of the institutions, what results are hindered or diminished by the normal working of the institutions, or by other factors in the social situation. To put it briefly, the principle presupposes our ability as a society to make shared teleological judgments about a range of institutions, their possibilities, and their histories. It will require at least some of the participants in making these judgments to be aware of relevant forms of social scientific knowledge, and it will benefit considerably from open and informed public debate about the experiences and reactions of different constituencies and of a broad range of members of the general public. That is, those persons who can be considered as beneficiaries or stakeholders of the proposed arrangements. This is, of course, a generalized and somewhat idealized account of how these judgments applying the principle of subsidiarity are to be made. In turn, it presupposes the ability of the people to participate in a functioning democracy and to learn from the testimony and arguments of competent experts. Subsidiarity is a principle for our guidance in the realms of prudence and in realms where there are normally ongoing and continuing disagreements, because the judgments are quite complex and involve considerations of fact, of value, of the priority of values, and complex judgments about what it's possible and necessary to do in a changing social situation. So this, I think, really does presuppose a functioning democratic society. And judgments about, interesting judgments about subsidiarity are not likely to be made in societies that are trying to organize themselves according to something like a model of military discipline. Where can we locate the principle of subsidiarity in the decisions we are called on to make with regard to economic and social policy? Pius refers to it as a fundamental principle, which suggests that it should come at the beginning. But it seems to me that this cannot be the case. As I've just argued, the principle in its working presupposes a lot in the way of prior judgments and shared social, cultural, and constitutional space. It does not seem to have the animating or the organizing power of the great revolutionary triad of values, or perhaps principles, liberté, égalité, fraternité. It is not easy to imagine great popular movements taking up the cry for subsidiarity as the basis for a profound social transformation. Solidarity, as we know, is another matter. In political terms, subsidiarity seems likely to function as a secondary and corrective value, destined for a supporting role in what we might call the revolutionary Oscars, so to speak. But even if it is secondary in the logical and rhetorical analyses, it may still be irreducibly important. Failure to satisfy the requirement of subsidiarity may well indicate serious flaws in an approach to constitutional design or to political action, flaws which may need urgent attention if grave evils are to be avoided. The principle of subsidiarity is a principle which is better understood as a distillation from the political and historical experience of a broad range of human society, rather than as a first principle affirmed in a simplified and fictional state of nature or original position. This goes with a view of the Church itself as being in the first instance a learner in these matters, learning from historical experience, rather than in the first case a teacher, ecclesia discens prior to being ecclesia docens. But to take up the central question about the principle of subsidiarity, what does it say? One way of handling this question is to present an answer in purely formal terms, somewhat similar to the classical understanding of justice, as rendering to each what is due without making any commitment about what is actually due and to whom. One could then say, give the task or the power or the resources to the institution or the party or the group which is capable of dealing most appropriately with the problem. One need not believe that this formal interpretation is mistaken in order to feel that it leaves out a great deal of what made the principle interesting and attractive to its proponents, beginning with Pius XI. It is clear that one of the main functions of the appeal to subsidiarity is that it can serve as a corrective principle to premature forms of intellectual universalism or political activism, which move too quickly to favor centralized or unitary approaches to complex areas of human experience and social life. It can also be used to indicate the shallowness of political slogans. An interpretation which would allow for this cautionary or corrective function of the principle would run along these lines. Other things being equal, prefer the solution or the policy which is private rather than public, local or regional rather than national, smaller rather than larger. These preferences will not always converge since they are logically and practically distinct. This is an interpretation which allows for a variety of applications and conclusions in different contexts. This interpretation states a presumption in favor of the private, the local, and the small. This is a presumption which can and should be overridden when going with the public, the national, and the large yields better results, involves lower costs, measured in time, resources, money, or when it lowers the likelihood of misunderstanding and mistakes, or when it has a negative impact on other significant values. But Pius actually says something more restrictive than this, for he makes it clear that he regards the unnecessary or unjustified overriding of the private, the local, and the small as a violation of justice and as a grave evil. He does not speak explicitly of sin, as many theologians and pastors would, nor does he refer, as most of us would today, to violations of rights. He is ready to affirm that failures with regard to subsidiarity are and can be significant moral failures. But his understanding of modern society is that while it relies on a range of institutions of different types, it is subject to powerful pressures or movements which threaten the continued standing and effectiveness of the private, the local, and the small. The desire to centralize and standardize, to impress by reason of size, the desire to eliminate existing abuses and to readjust the distribution of power and resources to ensure a better future are all desires which are not necessarily evil in themselves, but which can lead participants in revolutionary movements to attempt social reconstruction in a manner which is overly broad and sweeping and not respectful of the existing rights of others. Most of those whom Pius was addressing in the Catholic leadership would have thought the dangers of attempting broad social and political change in ways which did not respect the values implicit in the principle of subsidiarity were clearly manifest in the French and Russian revolutions, with the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 being particularly destructive. At a greater distance, we can see that similar criticisms could be made about the project of constructing the absolute monarchies, which those revolutions overthrew. Violations of subsidiarity have historically come from the right as well as from the left. Again, it may seem antiseptic and bland to think about the atrocities carried out at the slaughter bench of history, in Hegel's phrase, as merely failures to observe the requirements of subsidiarity. Speaking the language of subsidiarity, even in times of deep and serious conflict over the basic structure of society and its institutions, requires a willingness to accept the possibility that other groups with other functions will be able to contribute something distinctive and valuable to the shaping of the Commonwealth. It goes with the recognition that society's discussion and shared reflection on basic political issues will be seriously diminished if it is restricted to those who are like-minded with ourselves. The continued existence of significant differences within the social and political orders is to be regarded as a source of strength, vitality, and creativity, rather than as an invitation to factional strife and endless bickering. Subsidiarity is best thought of as a preventive measure against the gross evils of tyrannical and dominating regimes, not as a principle shaping direct resistance to them. If it is effective as an organizing principle for our thinking, It helps to bring out a form of society which is pluralistic and dialogical, in which people give each other reasons and a patient hearing so the differences can be clarified and at least partially reconciled. The good society is not envisioned as the imposition of a single ordering principle, nor as the fashioning of some sort of military or moral phalanx marching in unity against internal dissidents and skeptics, as well as against external foes and aliens. In a good society shaped by the principle of subsidiarity, opportunities for dialogue and for participation at various levels are prized and valued both for the instrumental contribution which they make to the discovery of intelligent and fair ways of doing things together, and for the intrinsic value which they have as expressions of how we understand ourselves as human beings in community and how we shape a common future. This goes against two styles of politics. First, the mobilization of the masses, which was the crucial step in the march to power for the totalitarian political parties which were on the rise when Pius XI was writing, and which were to a large extent a continuation of the starkly adversarial and authoritarian experiences of major European societies in the First World War. And secondly, the polarization of contending parties, which by stages comes to regard consultation, negotiation, and compromise on currently contested issues of political life as politically naive, morally corrupt, religiously unfaithful, and theoretically inconsistent. It is this second possibility which strikes me as the more troubling possibility in the contemporary American situation. Both these possibilities threaten to terminate public debate. The mobilization of the masses by intimidating opponents or independent voices, the polarization of the parties by leaving independents and moderates with a profound distaste for the public arena and its endless wrangling. Both possibilities can inflict grievous wounds on the body politic. The first by applauding the forcible elimination of opponents and critics. The second by using its ability to prevent consensus in such a way that some problems simply cannot be addressed in a timely fashion. I submit that there are good reasons for thinking that neglect of the principle of subsidiarity exposes the body politic to serious and avoidable dangers, even if the generic terms in which the principle is stated do not make it easy for us to specify these dangers in concrete and vivid forms. With regard to the economic structure of society, Pius emphatically warned against leaving things to, as he put it, the free play of rugged competition, and speaks of all the errors of the individualistic school. For Pius, free competition, however, though justified and quite useful within certain limits, cannot be an adequate controlling principle in economic affairs. To assume that the closer society approaches to the minimal state, the closer it will come to making subsidiarity a reality, would create gross distortion of the way the principle is supposed to function. Pius would like to resolve some of the hard problems by invoking ideals of cooperation between capital and labor. Pius thinks that a just society has to avoid both individualism and collectivism, and he explicitly warns against the dangers of economic dictatorship, even while he calls for competition to be controlled by public authority. This requires an ethos of compromise and mutual respect. Coming 30 years forward, John the 23rd, in Pacem and Terris, has a brief but significant treatment of the principle of subsidiarity, which points us in another direction from the use Pius XI had made of the principle. Instead of being focused on the dangers arising from national governments and revolutionary movements destroying private and local institutions, he was reacting to the collapse of international order, which was manifest in World War II, and to the difficulties of international cooperation in the period of the Cold War. He argues from the scope and character of the international common good to the moral demand for a public authority which can effectively pursue that common good, Pacem and Terris 137. He wants this public authority to be, quote, set up by common accord and not imposed by force. He believes that it has to be both effective and impartial. He acknowledges the great disparities among nations with regard to economic development and military power, but also points to their sensitivity as regards their juridical equality and the excellence of their way of life. The project of moving to the universal common good must respect both the common good of individual states and the rights of the human person. So he concludes that just as there is a regulatory and controlling role for the principle of subsidiarity within each state, it is equally necessary that the relationships which exist between the worldwide public authority and the public authorities of individual nations be governed by the same principle. In this move beyond the pursuit of the common good within and inside the particular nation-state toward the universal common good, the principle of subsidiarity remains relevant. It is not simply a reminder that smaller is better. Rather, it involves a search for a truly satisfactory fit between the goal being sought, the problem to be solved, and the resources and capabilities available to governments and societies at various levels. Those who desire to be guided in their judgments by the principle of subsidiarity must be ready to accept the possibility that larger may be necessary and therefore better. This, of course, accords with the widespread recognition of the great importance of the goals to be pursued by the United Nations, as well as later and more regionally by the European community in its various stages of development. The Vatican, in its development of Catholic social teaching and in its diplomatic practice, has kept alive the memory of the enormous costs of European disunity and rivalry. This does not mean that John XXIII, his successors in the papacy, and the fathers of Vatican II have ignored the numerous shortcomings of the European project as it actually developed, or of the United Nations, for that matter. Adherence to the principle of subsidiarity is compatible with a sturdy realism in perceiving and accessing the movement of international affairs. But this cannot be the end of the story of subsidiarity. For even as regional and global institutions multiply their activities and their regulations, they raise more questions about the interweaving of their effects and about their ability to achieve their original ends. The question which the principle of subsidiarity is intended to address remains relevant in an age of globalization and of economic and military superpowers. The articulation and protection of human rights, opportunities for free exchange and association, defense of the autonomy of universities and professions, the defense of religious freedom, are all concerns that become more relevant, more pressing in these circumstances. A reasonable expectation for the future has to include the prospect of continuing institutional assessments and adjustments to ensure that the objectives which a particular society endorses are in fact attained by the harmonious working together of the various elements of society. Subsidiarity, since it allows for an allocation of tasks to different centers of organization and action in the body politic, encourages patterns of cooperation and of common scrutiny and experimentation appropriate to a free society searching for justice and intent on resolving disputes without violence or grave violations of human rights.